Welcome back to Philosophy from the Front Line. I'm Rob Robinson, your host. This is episode number 70. I have Clay Novak on. This guy has a very interesting background. Like if you troll him on LinkedIn like I did, as I always do before I get people on, kind of look at their background and see some of the things he's doing. He's got a lot of irons in the fire, which is super cool. And it always makes it for an interesting conversation. But we're going to talk some veteran transition stuff, and we'll probably talk a lot more than just that because he's a lot like me, served in the desert quite a few times and has some experiences that I'm sure he wants to share. But without further ado, I'll pass it over to Clay. Just give us a quick introduction about yourself, please. Thank you.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me on, first and foremost. So I'm Clay Novak. I'm a retired Army officer, career infantry officer, 5-tour veteran, probably a lot like you, 3 Afghanistan, 2 Iraq. I retired 4 years ago and transitioned out. I stepped into the business world because like a lot of infantry guys, we got a lot of leadership management skills, but not a lot of transferable skills, right? Which is tough. It's not like we were MPs or logisticians or, intel folks or whatever. I also decided to step away from the DoD umbrella, which I know a lot of folks like the comfort of that when they transition out. I wanted to try something different, so I stepped into the business world. I spent about 3.5 years there, and truthfully didn't enjoy it very much. Mostly because it was a cultural shift for me and for a lot of us, and that is, we spend, a career focused on people and mission accomplishment and teamwork. And when you get into a lot of businesses, the bottom line is the bottom line, and that is the dollar. It's the profit, right? So, people are not necessarily always the focus. They're a focus. Good businesses always focus on their people, but it's not the focus. Mission accomplishment for them is not necessarily the way we defined it as we did in uniform. And really what it boils down to is the dollar. And I wasn't terribly comfortable with it. So I transitioned away. But in the meantime, you said it before, a lot of irons in the fire. Really what I started to do as I transitioned out was I started to write. And that's my passion right now. My biggest project that I'm doing is I'm an author. And I didn't do what a lot of folks did. I didn't take stories from my 5 tours and my 25 years in uniform and write an autobiography or any of that kind of stuff. I wrote a fiction novel. And it's an interesting story how that all evolved, but it was part of my transition. I probably like you, Rob, I got a lot of mentors, picked up a lot of mentors across the years in the Army. And some of those folks and pretty senior officers, great guys along the way, told me, when you transition out, you're going to have to learn to, you're going to have to downshift your brain a little bit, because the op tempo, mental and physical op tempo that we ran in the military for all the years that we did it, is high, and it's higher than most businesses. No matter what position you're in, it's just a high op tempo. And so, they said, find something creative. And it was weird because I had multiple people use that same word, creative. And I never considered myself a creative person, right? I mean, as a type A infantry guy, athlete, right? I mean, that's creative is not something that we necessarily, that's not a box we put ourselves in. It's not like I painted or sculpted or anything, I'm not a musician, right? But a good friend of mine, as we all keep tabs and keep in touch with, those close personal friends that we pick up through service. One of my close friends said, "Hey, you were always a really good writer, staff writer, produce good products, when you weren't in command." And, that he said, "Why don't you try writing?" And I had never considered it. And really in his head, he was talking about, taking the stories from the 5 tours and 25 years and writing a book based on that stuff. And I thought about it, and I wasn't terribly comfortable with it. But my best friend in the world, one of the few friends I've got from pre-Army, closest thing I have to a brother, is actually he works in Hollywood. He's a TV and movie writer, director, producer kind of guy. And he said, "Listen, man, fiction." He goes, "Try fiction." He goes, "There's no rules." He goes, "You've been operating under rules for 25 years. I mean, the Army gave you a lot of rules and you followed a lot of rules, but when you write fiction, you can make up whatever you want." You want to write,
Yeah.
space odyssey stuff. You want to write, he goes, it doesn't matter. Write whatever, makes you feel good. So I started writing, but I never had the intent to publish. I just started writing. And it was, like I said, I was in the business world, and I was, catch as catch can. Waiting for a meeting to start, I'd write for 10 minutes. Waiting for a Teams or a Zoom call to start, I'd write for 10. While I was eating my lunch, I'd write for half an hour. And it was just pieces and parts. And this story kind of evolved. And I got probably halfway through it, and COVID hit. And so I kind of, a lot of crazy stuff going on, as we all know, and I kind of shoved it aside, and really didn't touch it. And then I started to get a little bit of spare time, and I picked it back up again. And I decided, I was like, well, I'm gonna finish this. I'm just gonna see if I can write a whole book. And I wrote it, and I sent it to two people. I sent it to my dad, who is a voracious reader. Like, he eats books. It's amazing. And then my best friend, the TV writer.
Yeah.
And, I'm a Chicago kid, born and raised. My family's very blue collar. And my dad, read it. And his comment was, that was a really good book. Don't quit your day job. And, it's that tough love from dad. Right.
Yeah.
And that's what I got. And then my buddy, the TV writer, for a whole year, just kind of let it settle. And then finally said, hey, man, nobody writes a 300-page novel and doesn't do anything with it. You got to do something with this. So I looked at publishing. I looked at self-publishing, which I just kind of looked on the requirements of what it takes to self-publish, and it was more than I wanted to endure. And for a new author, just a forewarning for anybody who's out there trying to get a publishing contract with a big publisher, Random House and places like that.
Yeah.
Unless you're a known person, is very difficult to do. Right. And don't get me wrong, there are military folks that do it all the time, but those folks have got, like, Distinguished Service Cross kind of stories. Like, it's something very special, not out of the norm, truthfully. So I found a publishing company out of Virginia Beach that does hybrid publishing. So the way that works is, I had the whole novel, it was done. I submitted it to them. They said, hey, yeah, this is great. We'd love to publish this. So I entered into a contract with them. I paid them some money to do the things that I didn't want to do as a self-publisher.
Yeah.
They did the page layouts and the editing and the cover design and ISBN numbers. And, they're wired into a printer, and they're wired into Amazon. And so I went through so the distribution part of it, right?
Yeah.
So I went through the 10 months or so of that process, maybe a little less, maybe 9 months. And then it got published. And so that was December of last year, it got published. So it's been about late December, right before Christmas. So it's been about 7 months. And the one thing that my publisher doesn't do is marketing and publicity. That's all on me.
Yeah.
So that became a whole different, a whole different effort. The book was done, was published, it was ready to be sold, but I had to make sure people knew about it, and, like, beyond people, friends and family kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, it was a skill set that I had to develop along the way, because I had no background in it. None of us do, right? How do you run a business? How do you do marketing and publicity? We don't know how to do that stuff. So, it was and continues to be on a daily basis, a fight. You're trying to gain traction and gain ground. So, I've reluctantly, although it's a necessity, I'm on all the social media stuff, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, it's a requirement, but so I got into that. I'm doing merchandise now, I'm hats and t-shirts, and I sell signed copies of the book off my own website. I blog often. I get a decent amount of following on from blogging. A lot of my blogs get 100 touches Some of them, I had one that I wrote about the base renaming, exploded,
Hmm.
10,000 clicks, right?
Yeah.
Um, you know, but it's all new, and really the key to all of it is that we have been trained and bred, and it's in our DNA to just not quit,
Yeah.
and that's probably the biggest thing that has carried me through all this stuff is it's been very, very easy. It could have been very easy on a number of occasions to just say, screw this. Whatever comes out of it comes out of it, and whatever. And truthfully, when I went into this, I had no expectations, which maybe wasn't the best idea. I probably should have had some expectations, but I
Yeah.
didn't. But it's been, just keep slugging along. Keep trying something new. Keep putting yourself out there. Keep talking to people. Keep posting. Keep gaining as much visibility as you can, because that's the only way that this thing's going to take off.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting. It's been an
Yeah.
interesting. You probably went through the same thing as you launched your podcast, right?
Yeah,
It's
and I was just about to
yeah,
say that, it's really, you got to find your voice. And that's one of the difficulties that I think a lot of veterans, particularly like in the new media space, want to do. It's like what's your voice? Because we already know, there's the Joe Rogan podcast where you got Jocko, and these guys are not sponsors of the show, but I got to put it out there because they have a format, they have a certain way that they do things, but they found their voice over, the course of hundreds and thousands of episodes of finding their voice. And one of the most difficult things is figuring out what the first one is going to be, and as for you as an
yeah,
author, figuring out what the structure of your first book was going to be was probably just as interesting as like, hey, I'm going to do a podcast about veterans transition, because there's lots of transition podcasts out there, but how many do we really like get into the story of the people that have transitioned? We give you all these tips like, hey, do this, fill out this checklist, read this book, whatever. But
yeah.
what we don't do is genuinely talk to people about like their story. And I've had some great ones on here. I've had some ones that were like, oh, that was mildly interesting. But at the end of the day, your transition story or even starting a business is a unique part of who you are. And until we understand that, we're never going to get it right, because I can talk to somebody and say, hey, these are the 87 things that I did to be successful transitioning. But if they don't have the same family situation or financial
Yeah.
situation or anything else, it could be drastically different. Even one of those pointers could cause you to fail or not succeed or delay something. Whereas, for me, it worked out differently. So I think that's a very important point. And digital natives versus people that remember having phones hanging up on the wall, right? Like we're in that generation of folks that had phones hanging up on the wall. Like I was
Back.
said this, I said this to somebody the other day, like, for some kids, for our generation, Ice-T was the guy that was, the gangster rapper. For most kids in their 30s and under, he's the dude from Law and Order, right? And that's a drastic period of time. And like even he's changed and evolved over the time of who he was when he first started doing music into the guy that he is today. And so it's always interesting to make those comparisons. And I think our generation is lucky enough to kind of straddle the fence of like the big technology boom versus analog versus digital. I think we have a really great space to be that way. But getting back to your transition story, you told us what you're doing now. You are an author, obviously, and you're working to build that brand. But what made you leave the military? Because I know from in my perspective, it was like, hey, I'd done 23 years, I've been running around, I've done all these things, and it was just like I finally got that look in my eye that I saw the other staff colonels when I was younger on the division staff, going, okay, I kind of get it why they're leaving now. Was it something that kind of drove you there? Did you just stop, tired of not being home? I think, for me, that was one of it. But like, there's so many different aspects of why somebody makes that decision. So in your case, what made you say, hey, I'm going to pull the trigger and step away from the uniform and do something different?
So it was really a combination. Everything kind of peaked at one time, and so part of it was the being gone. I said it. 5 deployments, but the untold part of that was, mixed in to some of those deployments was also an unaccompanied year in Korea, right? Which it's like back then you talk about changes, right? Now Korea is a deployment, right? It's a unit deployment. Back then it was just a 1 year individual fill kind of a thing. But I had a span, um, you know, my son was, he was born in March. I left in June for Korea, right? So that's start the 5 year clock right there. So in a 60-month span over the next 5 years, I was gone 40 out of 60 months.
Wow.
Right. Right. So in his first 5 years, I only saw 2 years of that. And it was, it was rough, and the train wasn't slowing down. So that played a part in it. Um, and I had a couple of really tough, deployments back to back. I was an S3 and XO, 6 months of each while we were in Baghdad in an infantry battalion. I was home for 7 months, and then I went to go be an aide for a 3-star for 13 months in Kabul with just 7 months in the middle. And those two, and you make the decision at the time, right? That's a great career progression job. You learn a ton. I will tell everybody that I learned more in those 13 months than I did in the other 24 years I was in the Army, just through exposure. But the op tempo was nuts. I mean, it was literally a 20-hour-a-day job for 13 months, nonstop. And people think, oh, well, you were an aide. Well, let me tell you something. That life is rough. And I had a great boss. It had nothing to do with my boss. It was the requirements of the job for anybody. I mean, we were in Kabul. He was running the ground war in Afghanistan. We were busy, right, on the daily. But anyway, I got to the point where I was tired. My family was tired. My body started to break down. And then, I got some indicators that, like a lot of us, my TBIs were really starting to take a toll. I didn't even know how many I had. I just knew I had them. When I did all my transition stuff, I found out through a lot of analysis that I'm in the ballpark of about 12, which is abnormal even for professional athletes. You're a football guy. 12 is high. But I've got been diagnosed with complex PTSD, just from the high op tempo from so many years. So it all kind of came together at the same time. And then I looked at my kids, and my daughter was going into 10th grade, and she had already been in 9 different schools, and it was just it was time. It was time for everybody. So I just decided that was going to be the end. I did another couple of years working like you did, a very staff admin kind of job, and kind of saw my way out. And it's been 4 years. I have, you miss the normal stuff. Do I miss the soldiers? Of course I do. Right.
Yeah.
You miss all of that stuff for sure. Do I miss all of the, painfully administrative crap that comes along with being in the military? Not even a little bit. Right. I don't regret retiring, but I also don't regret my service at the same time. So it was, for me, it was a culmination of family being tired, me being tired, my body starting to quit. And as an infantry officer, as you well know, if you can't do it physically, then don't do it, because you're not doing anybody any good if you can't. So yeah, it was time for everything. All the indicators were there. It was just time to go.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that like is lost on a lot of folks. And that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast, is because it's like, hey, you don't know when you're done until you know when you're done. And
Yep.
we've all watched like the football player that play, look at Emmitt Smith. Emmitt Smith ends up at the Arizona Cardinals, and I'm by no means a, Arizona Cardinals or Dallas Cowboys fan, but like, look at the way his career ended because he stayed around too long.
Yeah.
And for us as leaders in the military, if you stay around too long, you could make a decision that could end up costing somebody their life. And I think that's the biggest difference, is when you're in an environment where, you screw something up, yeah, you lose some bucks, or, maybe, you end the season not as good as you came into the league as. But like, when you're looking at people's livelihoods or taking care of soldiers, which is like, that is your life. And we forget so often that your family's part of it too. When you look at, Fort Liberty, 75% 75% of the soldiers on that post are married or
Yep.
have children, right? So when you lump that in, there's 96,000 ish folks there. So you're looking at least another 70,000 people that are attached to those personalities that are living and working on that military base. And when you put it in that perspective, it's like, man, like I can understand how people get tired. Like I completely understand multiple deployments. You know, the old Army work rest cycle that they said that they were going to, oh, you're going to have 2 years of dwell time and you're
Yeah.
going to have, 1 year
Yeah.
overseas. And like, that briefs well, but I don't think it played out the way that, like, maybe for the folks that were not in operational units, it worked out that way. But if you were in grunt world, like you literally PCS into the next unit, it's like, hey, don't unpack your bags because we're
Yeah.
leaving in 6 months,
Yep. That's a
and
fact.
that's happened on more than one occasion, or I can remember early in the war, they kind of gave us the old, like, hey, we're going to send all you guys to RTB. So literally, like, I was running into dudes that I shook hands with on an OP in the middle of Iraq in downtown Mosul that were there 6 months before me, and I got there 6 months after them. And then, we all kind of flushed out together 07, 08 to go back to war, and just the machine kept going. And
Yeah.
like there's people that I had more conversations with in like the airport en route to and from Iraq or Afghanistan than I did back in the States. And
Yeah.
it's not supposed to be that way, but that's kind of the way that it happened. But understanding, injuries pile up, particularly if you're a paratrooper, or if
Yeah.
you're in the organizations that do a lot. And be thankful if you're not, because you have the luxury of time, and occasionally not having to go do this craziness, because like I live in the footprint of Fort Bragg or Fort Liberty. I get used to saying that, but I live in the footprint, but I'm close enough to watch the C-17s fly over Sicily drop zone, but I'm far enough away where I don't have to be impacted by it other than by the noise. But anytime I see like a multi-ship fly over my house, it's like, well, right now there's some kid getting ice sheeted right now. There's a medic that's scrambling all over the place. They're trying to figure out how I get these heavy drops out and all the other things that go with being a paratrooper. And that is a daunting life. And so, there's the Army, there's paratrooper life, and then there's the spec operations life, and all of which have their pluses and minuses, and you
Yeah.
can't really account for those until you're out of the big green machine. So it's like you said, I'm thankful to be far enough away. Don't miss any of the shenanigans, miss all the people, which is very, very true.
Yep.
Uh, so you talked about your publishing. What you're writing a book. I mean, most people always say like, oh, I'm going to write a book when I get out, because like everybody has their adventures that they've logged or blogged or written about all their life. So, you started that. Was it a singular idea that you started from, or did you like kind of whiteboard this thing out, or was it just like, I'm just going to keep writing? Cause you said you kind of wrote it in chunks, but did you have like an overarching theme or plan that you were going for, or did it just kind of come
I didn't
together?
even know this was a thing until I did another podcast a couple of months ago, and the host there said, "Oh, because I was describing how I wrote, and I write without an outline and without a story arc. I just write." And she said, "Oh, you're a pantser," and I was like, "What? A what?" She said, "A pantser. You write by the seat of your pants." And I said, oh,
Nice.
if that's what it is, then that's what it is. Then I guess
Yeah.
I'm a pantser. So really kind of the way that my writing evolves is the way it started was kind of just a literal vision in my head, right? I just kind of had this opening sequence in my head of this guy, waking up to this old alarm clock, and kind of not needing the alarm clock, right? As most of us do, right? You're probably the same way. Like I get up 5 minutes before my alarm, no matter what time I set it.
Yeah.
And that was the start in my head. It was just this view of him, this guy waking up, this retired Army guy waking up and looking at this old alarm clock, and he knows it's going to go off, and he knows he's 5 minutes ahead of it, so he might as well get up anyway. And that literally was the first thing, and that's the first thing in my book. That's the opening sequence of my book, and I just took it from there. I'm like, okay, well, what happens next? And he walks downstairs, and and he's got this lady love interest that he's involved in, but she's a PhD, super smart lady. She works in the intel world, but she's just brilliant woman who, gets pulled in by all the comms, CENTCOM and FORCECOM and all the comms, right? Because she's an expert in Middle East, history and all this other stuff, right? And so I would write and then I would think, and then I would write and then I would think. Because again, like I said, I did it in chunks. So I would write a little bit and then I would think about what comes next. And then I would write some more. And then I would think about it and then I would write some more. But I never had like, this is how it's going to end. Never, never in the whole process did I have an end decided until, I think before editing the novel was about 300 pages. I think after editing and after they did the page layouts and stuff, it ended up about 270. But I was probably in that 300 page novel, I was probably 250 pages in before I knew how I was going to end it. As crazy as that sounds. But that's how I write. That's my writing process. I know that doesn't work for other people. There are people who dry erase board the whole thing. They story arc it out. This is how it starts. This is how it ends. And then they work the pieces and parts in between. When I was writing, I was never intending to publish. So the characters in my books, and I say books because the first one is published. I've got 2 more already written in the series. They're ready to go. But the characters are based on either, kind of an amalgamation of people that I know, or there are certain characters in my books who are, 99% people that I know. And when they've read it, they recognize themselves in the books. But you're right. For me, you write what you know. The main character, Terry Davis, by the way, the name of the book is Keep Moving, Keep Shooting. The main character, Terry Davis, is, go figure, he's a retired infantry officer, spent the, lifetime in the global war on terror, just like the rest of us did. But he's nobody special. He's not a Navy SEAL. He's not a Green Beret. He's not a Delta Force guy. He's just a regular old infantry officer. And not surprisingly, his career looks a lot like mine. You write what you know. It's just easy that way. So, so I based a lot of him on me, again, with no intent to publish. And when I say based on me, it's based on my kind of life timeline, not necessarily me, my personality, or me, who I am, kind of a thing. Although people would tell you there are similarities there, but it was never a plan. There was never a plan. There was never a start and an end. It was just write and think and write and think and write and think. And that's how my writing process works. And again, I know that doesn't work for a lot of people, but that works for me.
Yeah. But it also sounds kind of like a strategic planner, you know what I mean? And like when you really think about strat plans and you start looking at, the eggheads of the military, for lack of a better term, that's how they have to operate, right? Because we know, and the trend that's coming out now recently with a lot of feedback from leaders and people that have been over to Poland and observed some of the missions that are going on in Ukraine, you have to have these 60-day cycles, right? They're saying that the TTPs are evolving every 60 days. And it was about every 90 days during GWAT. There was going to be some breaking change that's going to have to force you to readdress your strategy. So I don't see that as a bad thing. Probably not the way that I would do it, not because of anything else that I do, but I like free flowing discussion, so I would be willing to take like input or feedback and kind of make changes on the fly. But I mean, it's very, very iterative process, which still resonates with me because I can understand like, hey, look, there's certain things that are going to happen. Then I got to think about what's going to happen next. And that's just branches and sequels based off of, the situation that you're in.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's just ingrained into us. And maybe, for me, it's like, maybe that's a podcast. Like, I'm going to do this one. And I'm going to talk to this person and I'm going to build it out this way. And so I think there's inherent skills. And that's one of the things that I always try and encourage anybody as you're thinking about your transition, think about all the gray space that your skills kind of fill in that you don't really think about. Was writing one of it? Like, yeah, it was. It turned out to be a skill that you had already, but you were able to turn it into something that you could be passionate about in retirement. And I think a lot of folks get caught up with, well, I got to get paid what I'm worth when they first get out of the military. And that leads you down the path of going to work for some big business and you're training up, your camouflage for a 3-piece suit.
Listen,
And
Rob, I'll tell you that's you're trading a good paycheck for a lot of misery. I'll be honest with you. That
yeah,
just my take. But if you're looking for the paycheck, and I don't care if you retire, especially retired. I won't say that the E4 E5 who gets out after 4 years. That's a totally different discussion. But if you're a long term senior NCO or field grade officer, the big paychecks are out there. They're not hard
yeah,
to find. But I could tell you that you are going to live the same lifestyle that you lived in the military because the expectation is the same. You're going to work 60 hours a week and you have to make that decision if that's what you want to do. And after a couple of years of working in business, I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. I did that for 25 years in uniform. I did
yeah,
it for 3 years after I retired, and I'm not in that life. I don't want to do that anymore. I'm
yeah,
I'm it's that but you can get paid for it. If money is your goal, for those folks that are, a little older, kind of in our class, and spend 20 plus years in the military, you can find those big paychecks. They're out
yeah.
there, but you got to be willing to continue to be a part of the machine, like you said, and work those crazy hours to get paid for it. But you can live pretty comfortably.
Yeah, and I think it's just what's acceptable for you. And again, those are
Yep.
decisions that you have to make with your family. You have to make it with
Yeah.
with yourself, and understanding like there's a whole bunch of people out there that will take advantage of you just because you served. And not in a good way and in a bad way. Like there's some
For sure.
organizations that want to hire veterans just because they know that like I can drop a whole bunch of you guys in a room with a crazy problem, shut the door, come back 2 hours later, and there's a rough solution, if not a solution that's above and beyond what I could have thought about. But there's also those people that want to hire, like, oh, Clay just retired from the military. He's a colonel, field grade officer. Ooh, I bet you he's got a Rolodex and he's got a lot of connections. Oh, he
Yeah.
was a general's aide. Hey, let me hire him for a little bit so I can milk that Rolodex as long as I can, so I can advantage myself, not the company, myself. And I've worked for folks like that when I retired, and that was part of the reason why I kind of moved away from those positions as well, is because you know, although they say that the infantrymen aren't the smartest in the world, we can smell a bad leader almost immediately when you walk into the room. So it's like, hey, I'm going to give this dude the benefit of the doubt for about 60 days. And then after that, like, we're going to have to go in a different direction. And that's just because we're so used to dealing with people that's our livelihood. So we understand, personal and human capital very well is probably the
Yeah.
easiest way to say it. But I really appreciate you coming on today, man. This has been a great conversation. I'm anxious to get the book. I wish I would have had a little bit more time to kind of read it beforehand because it sounds always interesting. And one of the things that I always tell people about military authors, particularly those in the nonfiction space, is like there's nothing ever groundbreaking that comes out of any military book that you read. If you served in the military, there's nothing groundbreaking for you. There's some great authors out there. There's tons of books, but like if somebody tells a story about property accountability, I guarantee you have one and I have one, and
Yeah.
everybody that I served with
Yeah.
has a story about, let me tell you, when this knucklehead lost $10 million of equipment.
And it's you're right, man. It's whether I could tell stories about bad night jumps, so can you, right? I could tell
Yep.
stories about hot days in Baghdad or Kandahar, or whatever, so can you. Like those most of those books are they're telling the stories that everybody has, and so it's nonfiction is a challenge for anybody,
Yeah.
because
Yeah, it
it's
really
there
is.
there is nothing groundbreaking. You said it perfectly. Mine's a fiction novel. It's Jack Ryan, Jack Reacher, Jason Bourne, kind of action fiction novel. It's called Keep Moving, Keep Shooting. If you're if you're a recreational shooter, gun guy, gun gal kind of person, it's there's some good action shooting kind of stuff in there. There's a touch of technical in there. It's been compared to some early Clancy. If you
Yeah.
like the old Clancy stuff, Hunt for Red October, Red Storm Rising, those kinds of books.
Yeah.
If you read and as most of us did, young infantry officers, if you read the W.E.B. Griffin series, Brotherhood of War, Lieutenants to Captains and Majors, all those books, I've been, my writing style has been compared to that as well. So if those are the kinds of books that you enjoy, I think you'll really like Keep Moving, Keep Shooting, and hopefully I can sell enough copies. This is the goal. I can sell enough copies to continue some of the altruistic, philanthropical stuff that I've been doing. I've gotten involved with a couple of foundations. One of them being the Alan J. Lynch Foundation. Alan's Vietnam era Medal of Honor recipient. He's the only one Medal of Honor recipient living in the state of Illinois. I consider Al a friend. He does great things for veterans. Lazy Lab Hunting Club is another one. They use they call it outdoor therapy for veterans. So they use hunting, fishing, shooting kind of excursions to help veterans out. And then Phantom Airborne Brigade, a bunch of guys, a bunch of veterans I jump with down in Florida, round canopy, static line. A lot of times we jump out of an old World War II C-47 that actually dropped paratroopers in D-Day, which is pretty awesome. But that one's just that. It's a nonprofit, but it's a paratrooper brotherhood kind of thing. I walked in there the first time and jumped with those guys. I didn't know anybody walking in the door, and it felt like home. Felt like I was standing back on Fort Bragg. Hey, do you know this guy? Oh, I know that guy. Oh, it's 2 degrees of separation from anybody. Yeah. So the more books that I can sell, the more copies I can sell, the more that I can raise awareness for specifically those 3 organizations, as well as, do some financial donation stuff, which I've done already for those organizations. So my goal is to publish the sequel to Keep Moving, Keep Shooting for the fans, but also be able to, continue the philanthropy for specifically those 3 organizations and others, moving forward. So that's why I'm doing this. Really, really why I'm doing this.
Yeah, that's again finding a purpose, and I think that's the biggest part of hanging up the uniform, right? Like, you've had a purpose for 20 years or so, for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. And as you transition out and you hang that uniform up, it doesn't necessarily mean that you stop serving. And so you just have to find a different way to serve. And that's one of the huge struggles that some people have, is because they can't pinpoint what they want to do afterwards. And so first thing is like, you're not alone, because everybody kind of goes through, what am I going to do next? And that's where, podcasts like this come in. You get to hear 2 guys banter back and forth about what we did when we left the military. But the other part of it is maybe there's an idea. Maybe you always thought about writing a book and you didn't, or maybe you thought about starting a podcast. There's so many podcasts. For every 10 podcasts or every 10 books that are successful, there's about 1,000 that are on the trash heap of history, because people just start them and they don't follow through, or they don't find their passion or their voice when they're doing that. So again, super important to really dive into what you're passionate about. And if you can help other veterans or help other people out in the process, that's just icing on the cake, because, helping yourself helps other people, and I think that's one of the things that we lose as well from service, is because, like, it's okay for you to be selfish in retirement after you separate. Like, you're so used to giving of yourself hours and hours and days of your personality. Yeah. The reason why it's lonely at the top is because you ain't got nothing left, after you've been a leader for so long.
Yeah.
But, in retirement, that's your opportunity to kind of get some of that back. And I'm not saying to go out and, be this isolated jerk, because that's not going to help you, but be the type of person that takes care of themselves first, so you can see the bigger picture and see the 30,000-foot view that you wouldn't normally have when you're day to day, running down Ardennes or some other street, no named in, the country. But Clay, I really appreciate you having on. So last thing is, you said Keep Moving, Keep Shooting is the name of the book. Where can we find it? I know you said you have a website, and
so just want to get signed copies off of my website, if that's your thing. That my website is claynovak-author.com. Soon to transition to claynovak.com, but claynovak-author.com right now. Signed copies there, or you can find it on Amazon. You can search me, Clay Novak. You can search the title of the book, Keep Moving, Keep Shooting. It's there. You can get it on Amazon, hardcover, softcover, or even Kindle. We're working on an audiobook. Nice. That's kind of next in line. But you can get it on Barnes & Noble as well. But Amazon is probably the easiest, quickest for really anything. I hate to say it anymore. But my website, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Those are the 3 places you can get it.
All right. And one last thing, where can we find your blog?
Also on my website,
Oh, it's on your author
claynovak-author.com.
website?
Yep. There's a blog there, and it's a pick your day, whatever it is I feel like talking about, whatever's in the news. Sometimes it's politics, sometimes it's war, sometimes it's something that irritated me or made me happy. It just, that's the freedom of being retired. I can talk about whatever I want. So it's bits and pieces of everything. I usually put out 1, 2, sometimes 3 a week, depending on what's going on. Just keeps me writing, keeps people engaged, and generally the feedback's pretty good. So,
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Philosophy from the Frontline, episode number 70 with author Clay Novak. I'm Rob Robinson, your host. Hey, we will see you guys on the high ground. Thanks. Thanks for listening to Philosophy from the Frontline with Rob Robinson. We will bring you more interesting veteran transition stories, veteran advocacy, and more information in veterans transition in general on a podcast platform near you. This is Philosophy from the Frontline, and we'll see you on the high ground. Thanks.